Hi, welcome to Rec and Interview Live. My name is John Hammontree, and today we are chatting with Nancy Abudu, who is the Deputy Legal Director for Voting Rights with the Southern Poverty Law Center. Nancy, thank you for coming on.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
I know that we've all seen a lot in the news recently about the U.S. Postal Service experiencing problems all across the country, in part due to the pandemic. They seem to be quickly running out of money. There's been an effort to get more funding from the federal government. That effort has been stymied. Can you walk us through what's happening and how it relates to voting?
Sure. Well, the U.S. Postal Service really should be one of the most non-political, apolitical institutions that we have, because it is literally something that everyone in our society, regardless of your demographic, uses. And unfortunately, it's being put right in the middle, in the center of one of the most historic elections we're probably going to have in our lifetimes, and maybe for several to come. And so what we're experiencing right now is we're seeing how the Postal Service, in one important but not exclusive aspect of its work, is being used to really undermine our democracy. And that, of course, has to do with mail-in ballots.
And obviously, with a pandemic going on, a lot of people are afraid to leave their homes, understandably. And so we will see a spike in absentee voting. We already have in the primaries. We're certainly gearing up for that in November. My understanding is that the Postal Service could run out of funding ahead of that election. And just this morning in an interview with Fox Business News, President Trump said that that's in part by design, that he plans not to authorize additional funding for the Postal Service because he doesn't want millions and millions of ballots to be cast. He doesn't want there to be universal mail-in voting. What's the legal alternative here? What kind of actions are SPLC taking?
Well, as you said, that information is just kind of still news breaking. And we've also been tracking closely the Postmaster General in terms of who President Trump put in place to manage the Postal Service. So yes, the funding issue is crucial. We've been for funds related to the pandemic to be directed to the Postal Service because of the importance of the mail. Again, not just for mail-in ballots, but a lot of other social services people enjoy, like receiving their medicine, receiving their paychecks, their Social Security checks. And so again, for the president to try to politicize the Postal Service for his political gain and sacrifice not only the, again, opportunity to participate in the election, but also endanger people's lives in terms of what is sent through the Postal Service is absolutely unacceptable. And Congress really should be screaming in opposition and using all of its power to stop this immediately.
And you mentioned the Postmaster General. My understanding is we've also seen a recent shakeup of officials in the Postal Service. Is that right?
Yes. Now, this is one area where we have to admit it's kind of hard to keep up with the administration changing heads. But yes, our understanding is that there have been some changes or pushing for some changes. I believe Senator Warren actually has called for an investigation into Mr. DeJoy's financial dealings with arguably competitors of the Postal Service. And so the level of corruption that's happening from what was exposed with President Trump's tweet today to what's happening behind the scenes and only now being uncovered is just more evidence that this system really needs to be carefully scrutinized and addressed.
I want to remind everybody who's watching, this is a live show, so if you have questions for Nancy, please leave them in the comments and we will try to address them as best we can. So what could be the impact in a state like Georgia, where you're based, for example? We're looking at potentially 3 competitive elections, 2 Senate races and the presidential race there. If people are not able to get their ballots in on time, what does Election Day look like in November?
Well, if for folks who saw what happened in Georgia during our June 9th primary, I think you can take those lines and multiply them, because you're going to have individuals, the number of people who are requesting mail-in ballots is only going to increase. The number of people who are totally fed up with our political landscape right now will only increase. And that means those who do not get their absentee ballots but feel very strongly about exercising their right are going to be standing in very, very long lines. You're going to have a limited number of machines that are going to be overtaxed. Many of them are not even able to sustain the numbers that are regular in terms of usage. And poll workers, we know that that is a major issue in terms of shortages. And because of the ongoing pandemic, the ability of, the usual pool of poll workers to really provide that service, that's in danger. So those are just a couple of the worst case, but very probable scenarios we're looking at.
Now, I guess what options are on the table? It's not like we, the public, can go out and fund the Postal Service without congressional action. If President Trump has indicated that he would veto any bills that do further fund the Postal Service, is the only option a legal strategy and then waiting to see if it can make its way through the Supreme Court?
Multiple strategies, and that, of course, in terms of federal litigation, is one that should definitely be further investigated and explored if it makes sense. I think, however, the perhaps more expedient route would be Congress, that Congress immediately ensures that the funding related to COVID includes financing the Postal Service. And again, being led not just by the election season, but by the fundamental critical service that the Postal Service provides. And so those are two of the things that we would strongly recommend. But when we look specifically at voting, we know that there are some other options, with drop boxes, for example, being an option to avoid having to go through the Postal Service. And so those are things that we're encouraging counties and states to adopt in terms of being more creative in how they address these issues while they percolate through the courts.
Now, I have two follow-up questions there. One would be, what other concerns does the SPLC have about the November elections? And then the second would be, how can our viewers and listeners, how can they make sure that their votes will count in November? What action should they be taking, right now, 3 months out from the elections?
So in terms of other issues, because we're talking about the mail, of course, mail-in ballots are of serious concern, and the Postal Service is one aspect of that, but I think it shows how this is an issue that really can touch everyone. So some of the litigation we've recently filed has focused on expanding the qualifications to request a vote by mail ballot, because not everyone necessarily has experienced COVID firsthand. Some people are caring for family members or friends who are immune compromised. So that's what we've been doing. But we see now with the Postal Service issue, it's affecting those who already qualify under the existing laws related to vote by mail. So we're very concerned about how this is being expanded to not just pockets of our population, but really a lot more wide in terms of effect. We're also, so those are some of the things that we've been focused on.
On the topic of those lawsuits that you were talking about, there was a case, I guess, in Tennessee earlier this week or late last week, where the court did not order Tennessee to expand to their absentee process to people who are not at risk with COVID. Do you think that case will keep going forward to the Supreme Court?
Well, we know that there was a case, Wisconsin, if you remember, had one of the earlier primaries, and there was a challenge. I believe it was successful, and the lower courts made its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court essentially halted all efforts to ease the burdens of voting in person and absentee related to COVID. So we think that we've already gotten, unfortunately, a little bit of a signal that the court perhaps is too removed from everyday impact on regular people of having to vote during an election season when literally you don't know who you could interact with and end up sick and maybe even dying. So the Tennessee case, the case that we filed in Alabama, we also had filed a case in Louisiana. We've got partners who are filing lawsuits also around the country. So we're tracking all of that closely. But that's why, again, we can't rely solely on the courts. We've got to push Congress to do its part.
So for the people who are watching right now, beyond Congress, beyond the courts, what are some actions that they can be taking, to make sure that it doesn't come to a couple weeks before the election and they can't get their ballots in the mail?
Right. So I think the first thing is that time is everything right now and that we don't have any to lose. And so I would say if you haven't already, go ahead and request your absentee or vote by mail ballot. That's critical. We are trying to push for ballots to still count even if they are received on election day, which is prohibited in some states, or even maybe after election day if the mail is so messed up during that period of time. But regardless, we want to try to avoid people even being in that scenario. So request your absentee ballot in a request form. Make sure you return it as soon as possible so that, again, you don't lose any time in terms of the bureaucracy and administrative chaos that some places are going to experience. And then again, I know I've said it before, but putting pressure on our legislators to investigate and hold hearings, issue subpoenas if necessary, in terms of finding out what's going on and why we're even in this postal crisis in the first place, are some of the things that people can do. Now,
I guess there's also the option of in-person absentee in many states. How does that process work?
Well, in some places you are able to drop your absentee ballot off so you don't have to wait in line. There's usually a drop box inside. We've been advocating for curbside voting or at least drop boxes so that people don't even have to come inside, which oftentimes means that you're still restricted to the hours of operation of that particular building. And so those are some of the things that we have been advocating for, in addition to making sure that, polling places are maintaining or abiding by CDC guidelines. So they should be clean. They should be cleaned often. Spacing or distancing measurements should be strictly enforced. Machines should be wiped down after everyone uses them. So these are things that, again, vote by mail is important. It should remain a viable option, but in-person voting on election day is going to happen. Certainly.
I would guess that, most of us in America are used to knowing results on election night, maybe year 2000 notwithstanding. But when you have a large amount of people who are voting by mail, certainly we've seen in California and Washington, sometimes it can take a few days for results to come in. Is that something we should be prepared for in November?
Yes. So
does that concern you?
Does it concern? No, not necessarily, because the stakes are so high, because it's so important that we get this right, having been the first time of really, again, going through an election this critical during a pandemic, and all of the social justice issues in play with police brutality and racial profiling and the economy and people losing their jobs. The state of our election system, and we've got more elections coming, this is not it. And so I think that it is just for us to make sure that whoever is steering our national ship come 2021 is the person who legitimately won the election.
What are some lessons that we are learning in real time right now? I mean, as you mentioned, this won't be our last election. We'll have elections in 2021 and 2022, another presidential election in 2024. What are some lessons we're learning in real time about maybe some flaws in the system that have always been there that we can improve, next year, or we can even improve this year?
Well, no excuse absentee voting. I mean, that's one of the things that for us to be in this, situation where we even have to try to expand to cover those who are in legitimate fear of contracting the virus should be unnecessary. So that's something we should address. Early voting for sure is another area. There's some places that don't have it, or where it's still too restrictive, and the consequences are again limiting opportunities to vote even in person. So that's an issue we need to address. Felon disenfranchisement, that is another major contributor to the loss of voting rights for people, especially African Americans in the South, with Florida leading the way and places like Mississippi and Louisiana, not too far behind. So I think that we really need to look carefully at our country's commitment to redemption and integration in terms of people making mistakes, deserving a second chance, and really being able to have a say in their own destiny.
Certainly. You mentioned that we might not see the typical size of poll workers. Poll workers often tend to be senior citizens, and a lot of them might be staying home due to the pandemic. For maybe some of our younger viewers who want to get involved and make sure that there are a number of polling places that are open on election day, how does one go about applying to be a poll worker?
So I would suggest that they contact their Secretary of State or their county supervisor of elections office. There are some websites that actually allow people to apply online. Others may have to make a phone call, but what we've been pushing is that online and widely publicized in terms of hiring be done so that it's much easier, especially for younger folks, to apply. And now everything is social media. So really, if you are a county in need of poll workers, recruitment should not be your problem. Training, we can understand, but recruitment in this day, especially with so many people looking for employment, is really no excuse.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time, Nancy.
And
thank you to all of you for watching. If you want to know more about these year's elections, please subscribe to our podcast, Rec and Interview, available wherever you get your podcasts. And thanks again.
All right, thank you.